Chapters 11 and 12 of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. In the living room there had grown up a slight suspense. "What keeps Mary so long?" asked her uncle at length. "I'll go find out," suggested Elizabeth. And then, to the astonishment of the others, big Jess Dreer was seen to slip from his chair. The fire cast a gigantic shadow behind him against the wall. "If you don't mind," he said gently, "I think I'll step out and see." But at that moment the front door crashed, there was the metallic ring of the bolt driven home, and then Mary whipped into the room. A beautiful picture. A wisp of hair had blown across her cheek, her eyes were alight with excitement, and yet there was something akin to a laugh on her lips. "Jess Dreer!" she cried. "Follow me!" And before one of the others could so much as rise from a chair, she had raced across the room and out through the farther door, with Dreer gliding at her heels. Even then he appeared unhurried. "This way!" commanded the girl, and ran up the brief flight of steps that joined one stretch of the back hall with another at a higher level. They went down the passage at full speed, and then at the foot of it she cast open another door and beckoned him into the room. Once inside, she bolted the door behind her. From the front of the house there was a thunder against the door, and the voice of Morgan Valentine was calling, "Mary, what's this all about?" Jess Dreer took quick stock of the room. The moonlight struck in a broad shaft through one of the windows, and the rest of the apartment was filled with a dim, dim light. It was a girl's room. That indescribable fragrance lived in it like a spirit, and there were splashes of bright color, made faint by the night. "They're after you!" cried the girl softly. "Sheriff Claney and a man named Caswell, who has followed you from the south." She was shocked to see him leaning idly against the wall. "Now, think of that!" murmured Jess Dreer. "I figured that Caswell was a sensible sort of gent, and here he is trying to make a reputation by catching me. Well, they ain't any way of judging a man when he starts out to try to get famous." She gasped away her surprise. "No matter what he is, he may be a fool, but Sheriff Claney is a dangerous man. He's well known, too well known." "Mighty good of you to let me know about him. Come here, quick." "It isn't far to drop to the ground from this window. You see how the hill slopes away up just underneath?" "Dear me, now! But there's one great trouble. I have to get out to my horse and saddle her before I can start on." "You'll never ride that horse again. They found her in the corral, and they've saddled her to take you away on her." "I knowed Caswell was a terrible considerate man." She paid no attention. "You see that hill? Strike for that. Just beyond there's broken country. No horse can follow you over it. You have a gun?" "A sort of one." "Then go." "Lady," said Jess Dreer, "I'd a pile rather go on Angelina as a prisoner than go on foot a free man." She stared at him. There was the unmistakable sound of the splintering of wood. "Quick!" she pleaded, almost sobbing in her frenzy of excitement. "There's one or two things that sort of holds me back," murmured the bandit. "What? What?" "Look out yonder." She saw to one side, 50 yards away, two men sitting motionless on their horses. "Then you're lost." "I'm squeezed, anyways. And yonder's Angelina, I see." And following the direction in which he pointed, she saw another pair of men on their horses, with a spare horse held between them. "There's no hope? Tell me how to help you." "Lady, I sure appreciate all the interest you're showing." And with this he sank down upon a chair and crossed his legs. She stood back from him at that. "Are you going to give up without a struggle?" "I'm going to have a little think," said the outlaw. "I'd rather start a fight after I've thought it out than I would to have a partner to help me. 2 minutes of getting ready is worth an hour of hard riding sometimes." "I see. You don't really care if they do catch you. You haven't done anything very wrong. It doesn't mean that—" "A busted neck, that's what it means." "Then what he said is true?" "Most probable it is, lady. I ain't one of them parlor bad men that wears a bad look and a nervous hand. You got a lot of questions to ask me. Am I a downtrodden man that's tried to right my wrongs and get tangled with the law? No, I ain't. Am I a wild but naturally noble heart that's persecuted by the miserable world that don't understand me? No, I ain't. I'm plain Jess Dreer. Too lazy to work with my hands, and just able to get a good living with my gun. That's all. Now, take my advice. Get out of this room and wash your hands of me." "I don't care what you are," cried the girl. "I believe in you. There never was a scoundrel yet that was a truly brave man. Jess Dreer, I believe in you. But quick, quick, quick! Do something. There's no time. They've broken in the door." "That's what I've been waiting for," said the bandit, and he raised his great length from the chair and stretched himself. "Now that I got part of 'em inside the house, they're divided. That's the way old Napoleon did, I guess. But they're coming. I can do something. Raise a false alarm on the other side." He broke down with a strange heartiness. "You're the salt of the earth. Now, don't raise your hand. The fools have give me a chance, and I'll take it." A heavy rush of feet in the hall, a body smashed against the door, and the room quivered. "Open, Mary!" The surprise had brought a revolver in the hand of Jess Dreer, and even in that dim light the girl saw his face change. But he instantly put up the gun when he saw the door would hold. Now, wouldn't you think that wise gents like them would look before they leap? However, I won't wait for 'em. The door groaned under a new shock, and then Jess Dreer slipped his long body feet first through the window and dropped to the ground. She looked out. He had slunk into the shadow at the base of the wall, and had not yet been seen, and now she heard a brief, shrill whistle, twice repeated. It was answered by a snort of a horse, and instantly Angelina burst from the men who held her, and plunged toward the house with flying bridle reins. Out from the shadow leaped Jess Dreer to meet her. He had covered half the distance before he was seen, and before the others could start their horses toward him, he was in the saddle with a cat-like bound. The four men converged on him, and straight toward the middle of the gap he sent the flying Angelina. He lay flat on the back of the mustang. He had not even drawn his revolver, so far as she could see. But the others galloped with naked weapons. One of these flashed, and on the heels of the report there was a shriek from one of the posse who had been closing in on the other side. The bullet had missed the enemy and struck a friend. It gave Jess Dreer a winking moment of a chance. For the shout of the hurt man and the plunge of his body to the ground threw the rest of the posse into confusion. 3 horses were reined in 3 directions. Angelina rushed through the narrow gap between, and then Mary Valentine saw the fugitive strike out toward the nearest hill, with 3 pursuers laboring behind him. Each of them had a gun unlimbered. Each of them was pumping a hail of bullets after Jess Dreer, but they doubly defeated themselves by that very eagerness. For the racking gallop ruined their chances to shoot true, and sitting straight to fire, they could not get the best speed out of their horses. And in the meantime, Jess Dreer was jockeying the cat-footed Angelina through the rough ground at the base of the hill. She veered and dodged like a dancing will-o'-the-wisp, and presently darted around the hill into oblivion. The fusillade of shots had drawn the 2 sheriffs from the door of Mary Valentine's room. She heard them plunging through the house, leaving a trail of crackling oaths behind them in lieu of musketry. Afterward she waited in her room, terrified by what she had done, and though her aunt and then Elizabeth came and called her, she would not come out. She was spending that hour in profound thoughtfulness, and her thoughts were turning on that thing she had cried to Jess Dreer in her excitement: "There never was a scoundrel yet that was a truly brave man." Had she not spoken the truth by inspiration? She heard the wounded man groaning as he was carried past her door. That was one result of her work, no doubt. Then she heard the posse returning from a fruitless chase. At this, Mary breathed freely for the first time. Chapter 12. When she went out at last, she carried her head with a high stubbornness, and walked bravely into the living room. Elizabeth was not there. She was tending the wounded man, and the rest of the posse was either gone home or had found quarters in the house. But the 2 sheriffs sat opposite each other. They scowled at Mary when she came in. Only from Morgan Valentine did she receive the faint glimmer of a smile. As for Mrs. Valentine, she turned upon her niece a sombre glance that betided no good. "A pretty night's work for you, Mary Valentine," she said, "turning your uncle's house into a refuge for outlaws, and getting a man shot. All your work, too, Mary. And I'd like to know what you got to say to Sheriff Claney and Sheriff Caswell, that's come so far all to be fooled by your doin's." "Hush, mother," said Morgan Valentine. "That's a little too much." "Don't bother about me," said Sheriff Caswell gloomily. "I don't hold no spite agin the young lady, which I never knew women folk yet that didn't take the side of the underdog." "More power to the women," muttered Morgan Valentine. "Right," observed Sheriff Caswell, with surprising calmness. "I wouldn't wish my own girl to help corner a man. No, sir, and I don't hold no grudge, young lady, though you did lie most amazin' for that fox drear." Mary Valentine stood where the firelight could play full on her face, and there is nothing like firelight to bring out the luminous tenderness of a woman's eyes. She cast out her hands toward the two men she had disappointed. "How could I help it?" she said. "There were so many of you, and he was alone." They would have been more than men if they had not melted to some degree. Indeed, Mary would have done well on the stage. "And yet, I suppose," she said, slipping into a chair, "that he's a scoundrel, a worthless rascal." Mary was not very old, and I suppose she was not very wise, but she understood that the way to guide a man is to oppose him. "Really," she said, "the moment I looked at Jess Dreer, I knew that he was worthless." It caused Sheriff Caswell to take fire immediately, and inwardly she rejoiced. "Then you know more'n I do," he muttered. "But haven't you chased him 1,000 miles?" "I had to. I don't know just how many thousand they is on his head. It ain't the money I want. But if I can get rid of Jess Dreer, why, they ain't much chance of another bad one ever crossin' my trail. They keep clear of my country if they knowed that I'd run Jess Dreer to the ground." Mary Valentine shivered. She gazed with open admiration at the sheriff. "It must take courage," she murmured, "to follow a cold-blooded murderer." The sheriff looked at her. He was not displeased by her admiration, but he felt that he must put this very absolute young woman in her place. "If you call him cool," he said, "why, I call him that, too. But murder is a pretty strong word. Man-killer he is, there ain't any doubt about that. But murder, I ain't ever heard of his doin'." "Isn't that a close distinction?" she said. "Is there much difference between a murderer and a man-killer?" "To you, maybe not," said the sheriff deliberately. "To me, they're just about the world apart. A murderer is a snake that strikes for the sake of striking. A man-killer is one that fights when he has to." "But Jess Dreer? Why, he'll almost take water before he'll fight, that's how mild he is." She had to lower her eyes. Such a warm happiness had come in her blood that she feared it would shine out in her glance. "For my part," she said, "I think his mildness is just a sham. It looks snaky enough to me." "Then," said the sheriff, "you and me see with different eyes. What chance did Jess Dreer have, I ask you? Jud Lindsay's hoss is stole. It looks bad for Pete Dreer. Jud gets a crowd together. They put on masks and go to Dreer's house. They take Pete out, and when he says he's innocent, they laugh at him, the case was so black agin him. They take him out, string him up, and let him swing. Along comes Jess Dreer, and sees his father dead before the door of the house. He busts around town and finds out that Lindsay done it. Along about that time the real hoss thief is found with the goods. They bring him in. They ain't any doubt that old Pete Dreer was innocent when he was lynched, but he was such a queer, silent old cuss that nobody would have believed it, considering how black the case was agin him. Well, Jess Dreer buries his father, and then he goes to the sheriff and asks for justice on Jud Lindsay. Did he get it? No. Partly because there wasn't anybody that seen the lynching except them that was in the mob, and everybody in the mob was just as guilty as Jud Lindsay in the eyes of the law. So would they talk? Would they accuse Jud and accuse themselves at the same time? No, there wasn't any chance of that. Besides, the sheriff is pretty thick with Jud Lindsay, Jud having married his daughter, so he tells Jess Dreer to get out of his office and stop talking like a fool. You see, he didn't suspect that there was anything very hard about Jess. Nobody did. He'd been quiet as a lamb all his life. So Jess Dreer leaves the sheriff and goes out to the saloon where Jud Lindsay was. I was there at the bar, and I seen everything that happened. Jess walks in and stands there with his hands on his hips. "Jud Lindsay," he sings out, "I've been to the sheriff and asked for the law on you. But the sheriff has cussed me out and told me I couldn't come at you through the law, so I'm going to use my own hands. Lindsay, I'm going to kill you." Well, Lindsay turns on his heel, and has 2 guns out before you could wink, and he hits the floor without shooting either of them guns off. The reason why was because a slug out of Dreer's gun had gone through his heart. Now that was what opened our eyes to Jess. Jud Lindsay was called a quick man with his shooting irons, but beside Jess that day he looked as if he was standing still to have his picture taken. After Jud drops, Jess sings out in his quiet way, "Well, boys, you see what I've done, and I ask you, what other way out was there for me?" There wasn't any other way, and we all knowed it, so we didn't say nothin', and Jess turns his back and walks out without nobody lifting his hand. But old Pike Malone says to me, he says, "Caswell, there's a good man gone wrong to-day." And Pike told the truth. The sheriff went near crazy when he heard about the killing of his son-in-law. He rides up to the house of Jess Dreer and calls him out and cusses him up and down and tells him to come with him. The sheriff was aching for a gun play, but Jess didn't come halfway. He goes right along to the jail. Then comes the trial. They was 12 fair men on the jury, but what could they do? It was a plain case of manslaughter, the easiest they could let Jess off, and after he heard the decision, he busted jail. The sheriff followed hotfoot. Some said that he left the way open for Jess so that he could have the pleasure of dropping him with his own guns instead of waiting for Jess to serve his sentence. The sheriff runs Jess down easy, because the first place Jess went was home. The sheriff goes in for him, and the sheriff never comes out again. But Jess Dreer comes out, and rides off on the sheriff's hoss. They wasn't anything for it except to start after him with a posse. Not that any of us really wanted to tackle the job. But we couldn't have our town put on the map as an easy place for a getaway. That wouldn't do. We got our guns, and climbed on our hosses, and followed Jess Dreer for blood. He'd have got away because he has the real eye for a trail, and he knows how to shake any crowd that ever got together. But his hoss went lame, and we caught up with him." At this point the sheriff paused, sighed, and looked for a long moment at the fire. "That was the time," he said at length, "that Jess Dreer cut his name into the memory of the Southwest, and he cut it deep. Afterward Jess Dreer went on, and we went back. I got this that day." He touched a scar where a bullet had furrowed the base of his broad, tanned neck. "And now here I am on his trail," said the sheriff. He shook his head gloomily. "I may get Jess. Chances are that Jess'll get me. I ain't got no grudge agin him, but I got to make a place for myself. It's a gamble how the trail will turn out, but it's a sure thing that they don't want a sheriff long down my way until they find a man that can get Jess Dreer. What I've got on my side? Numbers. They don't count. You've just seen how he slides through 'em. What else have I got? The fact that Jess has got away so often that maybe his luck is just about played out. 8 years of luck. Pretty soon he'll tumble, and maybe I'll be there with a gun to catch him when he drops." At the conclusion of this tale there was a silence. Even Mrs. Valentine was motionless, and her knitting needles were crossed idly for the first time in many an hour. But Mary, without a word, got up and left the room. She walked with her head fallen. There seemed to be a haze across her eyes, for when she reached the door she fumbled blindly for it a moment. All of this Morgan Valentine saw. What passed through his mind it would be impossible to say, but when the door had closed upon his niece, he said softly to Caswell, "Sheriff, between you and me, I think it'd be a pretty good idea if you didn't talk no more to Mary about this Jess Dreer." "Why not?" "If you had a house built of dead leaves," said Morgan Valentine, "would you encourage folks to come and light matches in it?" End of chapters 11 and 12. Chapters 13 and 14 of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. There was no sleep for Mary Valentine when she reached her room after Jess Dreer had escaped. She had drawn a picture by guesswork, and the picture had become a living thing. She lighted the lamp to undress. At once the thought of going to bed became detestable, for she foresaw long hours of sleeplessness, twisting and turning from side to side. She tried to read, but the print tangled on the page, became a blur out of which grew a face and a form and a voice. Throwing the magazine away, she tried to daydream, but the living reality cut into the midst of her dream. She blew out the lamp, but the moment it was extinguished the pale moonlight cut into the room and brought back with breathtaking vividness the picture of Jess Dreer as he had got up from the chair and stretched himself before the window. At length she slipped into a deep chair beside the bed and dropped her face in her hands. Time cannot be measured in some moods. She could not tell whether it was hours or moments before there was a faint scratching sound outside her window, but when she looked up, there sat the long body of Jess Dreer in the window, jet black in the moonlight, in the very attitude he had been in when he dropped for the ground. She hardly dared to look again, and then she heard the ghost murmur, "Whist! Mary Valentine!" At that she started up, half fearful and tingling with a singularly happy excitement. But when she ran to him his greeting was characteristic. "Well, well, not in bed yet? Is that the way to treat yourself, Mary Valentine? I wouldn't treat my old hoss like that. Do you know that the sheriffs are still in the house? That they haven't gone to bed? That their men are here? Do you know that, Jess Dreer?" "I scouted around a bit first, and seen their hosses saddled like they was hesitatin' about giving me another run." "And yet you came back." "Not for fun," said Dreer. "Come inside. They'll see you sitting there." "This is good enough for me." "But if it wasn't out of madness, what was it that brought you back?" "Common sense. They'll hunt for me to-morrow over the hills. I'll be riding off the other way." "You're doubling on them. But Salt Springs lies the other way, and they're sure to comb the district around the town. They always do. The amateurs start by looking near home." "They're more generally right than the professionals, then. But Caswell is one of these crafty fellows. He starts right in to get inside my mind, find out what I'm thinking about, and then outguess me." He laughed softly. "Caswell follers me as if he was a general, as if I was an army with a board of strategy. And here I am, plain Jess Dreer. All I do is to act simple, and that always fools him." "Listen to me." "Yes?" "Jess Dreer, why have you come back?" "Oh, partly I've told you why, and partly because I left in such a terrible hurry that I forgot something. After all you done for me, I plumb forgot to thank you. So I come back to tell you now that you're the finest girl I've ever knowed, Mary Valentine." "Hush!" she whispered, and to cover her emotion and the tremor of her voice, she added, "Isn't that someone listening at the door?" "Not a soul. There ain't anybody near, and there's another reason why I had to come back. Like as not, you'll be hearing considerable talk about me the next few days. You'll be hearing about Jess Dreer the murderer, Jess Dreer the gambler, Jess Dreer the robber, Jess Dreer the no-good hound. Well, mostly I don't care what people think about me after I've gone by. My trail fades out, and what they think about me don't reach my ears, so why should I care? But this is different." He turned more fully toward her and looked up. She could see him frown with the effort of hard thought. "I ain't much good with words. I'm out of practice, too. But this is the way I feel. When I come to this house I struck soft dirt, and I've left a trail that's going to last. I got an idea that maybe you won't forget me for quite a while, you see." He spoke very apologetically. "I shall never forget you," said the girl. He paused. "No," he said carefully, "I don't think you ever will." It would have been disgusting assurance on the part of another man, but it seemed perfectly natural coming from Jess Dreer. "And here's the way I feel," he went on, "that if ever you should get your head filled full of wrong ideas about me, I'd know it if I was 1,000 miles away. I'd know it, and I'd feel like someone had stuck a knife in me, and then turned the knife. It would hurt, you see." She could not answer. "Maybe this'll sound all foolish to you," said Jess Dreer, "but what I say now I say because you're the first human being that's ever gone a step out of his way to help me since the law turned me out. You took a chance, you risked something, you got me a chance to get clear, and so what I say now I say for you and God and me to hear. That's a fact. I ain't going to pile up a lot of excuses. All I say is this: that first a wrong was done, and then I took the law into my own hands, and then the law threw me out. And since that time, no matter what liars say, I've never lifted my hand except to defend myself. They's another thing. I've took the money of other people. I'll tell you why. When they run me away from my home, they run me away from my own cattle and my own land. It was a good paying ranch, and I figure that the world owes me as much as I'd have made clear off that ranch. And that's what I take every year, or less, and I've never yet taken it from nobody who couldn't afford to lose it. Mostly I've taken it across card tables, but some I've taken at the end of a gun." He paused. Suddenly she was aware that he was in an agony, that he had spoken in an agony, that he sat now, waiting in a silent torment for her judgment. And a great humility rushed over Mary Valentine. An ache came in the hollow of her throat, and somehow, she herself did not know how, she had taken both his hands. "I'm talking the same way," she said, "for you and God to hear me, and I swear that I'll never believe harm of you, Jess Dreer." He raised her hand suddenly to his face. Her finger-tips touched hot, pounding pulses in his temples, and his hands were quivering. "God bless you," he said. Was it possible that he had kissed her hands? "For 8 years I've been riding on a lone trail," said Jess Dreer. "I've had the spur dug into me for 8 years, and a spur leaves scars. And now, for the first time, I've reached a stopping place." "If you can stay," she was whispering. "Oh, Jess, we'll find a way to clear you. Girl, you don't know men. But wherever I may go on the out trail, night and morning, I'll send my thoughts back to you." "Are you going?" "No, not yet. I have something to say. She could not finish the sentence. "But if you should ever need me, then send for me. I'm a gambler, as I've said, and there's a string of places through the mountains where they know me. In Salt Springs there's one. Dan Carroll knows me, and he can get word to me wherever I am, by underground wires. Good-bye." "Not yet, Jess." "It ain't right for me to stay. Is there something troubling you, girl?" At length she said, "Go now, quickly." He stared at her in wonder. She stood erect, her face was buried in her hands, and then Jess Dreer slipped down from the window. Afterward she cried out, or thought she cried out, but he did not turn again. After a while she saw him pass on Angelina over the top of the hill and across the moon. Chapter 14. Next to the rooster in the chicken yards, the cook is generally the first living thing to waken on a ranch. Even during the short nights and long days of early summer, he is in his kitchen while the dawn is still chilly and gray. But on the ranch of Morgan Valentine there was always one person up even before the cook began to rattle at the lids of his big stove, and that person was the owner. He was like one of those old-fashioned skippers who keeps only one eye closed, even during the dog-watch. Usually Morgan Valentine employed the early hours in a walk among the ranch buildings. He enjoyed that morning stroll, while the light grew brighter and brighter on the mountain tops, and the mists became thin in the lower valleys. Each day he watched his big domain unroll before his eyes, and the first pride of the possessor flowed back upon him. But this morning he went into the living room and knocked up a fire over the coals which remained from the night before. It burned poorly. There were charred ends of logs from which the smoldering heat had been eating the life all night, and now they glowed like charcoal, but would not flame. A thick smoke rose toward the chimney, and some of it rolled out and curled around the mantelpiece and filled the room with pungent scent. Morgan Valentine remained hanging over this dreary blaze. A man, if 50, is generally fat enough to content himself with the present, but when he turns back to the past, it is dangerous. And Valentine was thinking of the past. There had been something in Jess Dreer which made him reminiscent of the days when he and his brother became empire builders in this valley. Sitting before the fire, the rancher recalled how the tall man had sat back in the shadow and watched the others with bright, uneasy eyes. Like a wild animal, thought Valentine, which has come out of the night, and even in captivity carries with it an air of the freedom of the outer spaces. That was the thing which tormented him. Jess Dreer was free and penniless, no doubt, but freedom was worth poverty. Here was he, the rich man, tied down by his wealth. What had it brought him except an unloved wife and children who were hardly more than names to him? To Jess Dreer the whole mountain desert was synonymous with the word home. There was something infinitely attractive to Valentine in the character of the outlaw. There was an honesty, if that word could be used with a thief, that drew the rancher as he had never been drawn before to any man except his dead brother. Some one was coughing in the hall. He recognized his wife even before she appeared in the door. "Why, Morgan, I thought the house was on fire," she said, and straightway she went to a window and opened it. "The house was that full of smoke," she added, coughing again. He returned no answer to this, but kicked the log fragments again, and this time a yellow tongue of fire leaped out and hung for a moment, quivering in the mist of smoke as though it had a life of its own. After that the blaze began, and the smoke diminished. There had been a touch of irritation in that kick at the smoldering wood, but now he was able to turn his usual calm face toward his wife. "You look kind of tired," he said kindly. "How could I look any other way after last night?" "Bear up for a little while, mother. Mary is leaving in a few days, and then you can have a long rest." Maud Valentine regarded her husband critically. She had studied this silent man with profound attention for many years, and knew less about him now than she had at the beginning. "I've been thinking something," she said slowly, and folded her hands before her. "After Mary goes, every time you miss her, you'll look to me and be angry." "I'm never angry, mother." At this a little spot of color came up in each cheek. "I wish you'd talk straight out to me once in a while, Morgan. I wish you'd talk man talk to me now and then." He shrugged his shoulders, but she went on in spite of this danger sign. "Even if you was to storm at me, Morgan, I'd like it better than this." "I try to be kind, mother." "Kind!" she said. "Kind!" And there was a breathless little check in her voice. It suddenly occurred to the man that she was acting as if she had been enduring for a long time, and had now reached the limit of her strength. He braced himself with that chilly feeling in his back which a man usually has when he faces the hysteria of a woman. "Well," she said at length, so calmly that his nerves gradually began to relax, "we won't talk any more about her. We'll talk about you, Morgan." And she made a step toward him, as timid as a girl approaching her new lover, who has not yet completed his avowal. Now and then a sort of youthful beauty would flush across this middle-aged woman's face. "Just now," said he, "I'd kind of like to talk about her. You ain't apt to admire her, mother, but you got to admit that what she did last night was pretty fine." Maud Valentine blinked. "Fine?" she gasped. "Getting a murdering outlaw away from a sheriff? Fine?" "Two sheriffs," corrected her husband grimly. "Are you laughing at me, Morgan?" "I mean she took a bad job off my hands, mother." "Off your hands?" "Would you have had me let them take my guest under my roof when he come here by my invitation?" She found no ready answer to this, but nevertheless she instinctively shook her head. "If it hadn't been for Mary, I'd have had to stand back to back with that Jess Dreer, and fought him off." He sighed. "I think we'd have cleaned him up, but it would have meant that I'd be riding this minute beside Jess Dreer on the long out trail, no matter where it takes him, and every man's hand agin us. That's what it would have meant." "Morgan, I actually believe that you almost regret it." "Sometimes I don't know. But it's Mary that's kept me here." "Ah, but you don't look down deep and get the reasons why she done it, dear. Do you know what they were?" "Well?" She bore the patient, neglectful tone. "Because she saw that Dreer was paying a lot of attention to Elizabeth. She was not being talked to. She was jealous. That's the whole fact of it." "Maud," said her husband, after a moment of silence, "here comes the sheriffs. Maybe you better meet 'em, and make 'em at home." At that she regretted what she had said, for she saw the mouth of Morgan Valentine setting in a way she knew very well; but he had closed the conversation too definitely and pointedly for her to attempt to reopen it. The sheriffs were at least good losers. They made only laughing comments on their futile chase of Jess Dreer the night before, and they kept up the same cheery talk all during the breakfast. When Mary Valentine came down with Elizabeth beside her, they neither frowned at the girl who had broken through their trap, nor openly reproached her. If any one were estranged by the events of the night before, it seemed, oddly enough, to be the three women; for Elizabeth studiously avoided the eye of Mary, and paid strict attention to eating, and as for Maud Valentine, it seemed that her niece was not in the room for all the attention that she paid her. Charlie and Lewis were full of open admiration for the manner in which the outlaw had broken through. "But it must have been a lucky shot that he got in," said Charlie. "It ain't hardly likely that it was aimed, the shot that dropped Sam." "Do you see where it hit him?" asked Sheriff John Caswell, raising his head at this point in the conversation. "Clean through the thigh. He'll be on his feet again inside of 3 weeks, and riding after Jess Dreer." At this the sheriff smiled pityingly. "Son," he said, "Claney tells me you're kind of handy with a gun yourself, but you fasten on to this: if Dreer had wanted to kill Sam, he would have done it. That was an aimed shot, son, and don't make no mistake." "But it was night, Mr. Caswell, and besides, he was on a galloping horse." "Sure he was, but all Dreer needs is enough light to see what he's shooting at. He's a snap shot, son, and he shoots with a gun the way other men point with their finger. No, sir, he planted that shot on purpose, not to kill Sam, but to drop him off'n his horse. And here's another thing: Sam won't take the trail after Jess as soon as he can ride a horse again. Not him. It's a queer thing, but them that's ever faced Jess don't generally have any hankerin' to see him again. And them that seen him swing a gun jest naturally lose all appetite for seeing the same show all over again." "But you've been on the trail a long time, Sheriff," said Charlie. "It's different with me, son. I'll tell you how it is. Jess Dreer has made a fool out of me more times than you can count on your 2 fingers, and I don't mind much of anything except to have a man laugh at me. Well, they's been other men take after Jess that was a heap smarter men than I'll ever be, and they's been some that was faster fighters and straighter shots. Jess has fooled 'em all. He may keep right on fooling me, but he'll never shake me off'n his trail. I stay there till I come up with him, and one of us goes down. I ain't fast, I ain't smart, but I'm a tolerable patient man, son, tolerable patient." For some reason there was little talk at the breakfast table after this moment. End of chapters 13 and 14. Chapters 15 and 16 of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. It was the patient man who said to Sheriff Claney of Salt Springs, a little later, "Claney, have you been looking around over the ground this morning?" "What ground, Caswell?" "Round the house, where Dreer got away." "Yeah, I ran over a little of the sign. What'd you think about it?" "It was all pretty clear reading. I thought I seen the place where he dropped out of the window, and camped for a minute waiting before he whistled to that hoss of his, that Angelina you're always talking about." "Well, I'll tell you something, then, partner. There's some new sign this morning, something added on top of what there was last night. I seen where that long-steppin' Angelina went away, and I seen where she come back." "Dreer came back?" "Unless that hoss traveled alone, which ain't likely, I'd say." Sheriff Claney cursed fluently. "He come back to the house with you and me inside it?" "Yep, with you and me inside it, asleep. And he didn't only come back and look things over, he come back and went inside the house." Claney gasped. "Are you sure?" "Positive certain. And now, Claney, I think my hard work is over." "How comes that?" "It's the first time that ever Dreer took a back step on a trail. It's the first time that ever he took a useless chance. What was they for him to gain by coming back here?" Nothin' 'cept to sass us. Drear wouldn't even sass a 2-year-old kid. It means that he ain't the same man that he used to be. It means that he ain't workin' alone. Well, Claney, you know it's 100 times easier to catch 2 men that travels together than it is to catch one." "I don't foller yer, pardner." "I don't mean that they's really another man with Jess Drear. What I mean is that he's found somethin' in this house that he came back to, and I'd even talk up and say what it is." "Well?" "It's the black haired girl, I figure, and if he came back to her once, he'll come back to her again. It's his nature." "Soft on women?" "Never looked twice at one before, so far as I know. That's why I'm sure that this means somethin'. Drear has played a lone hand, but now that he's got somebody beside himself to think about, he's lost. Claney, you write this down in red, and remember it. As sure as there's rain and sunshine, I'm going to get Jess Drear, and where I get him ain't going to be far away from this house." "You're going to camp here and wait for him to come back?" asked Claney, smiling. "I'm going to camp near here," replied the sheriff from the Southland, "and I'm going to wait. Time and the black-haired girl, Claney, will win for me in the end." And the 2 men parted. It happened that at this moment Charlie Valentine and his brother Louis were standing on the veranda together and overlooking this scene. "What beats me," said Charlie, "is the idea of a gent like this Caswell taking a crack at Jess Drear. Why, Big Drear would bust him in 2 with one hand." "I dunno," replied Louis, in his mild way. "There's somethin' about Caswell. Speakin' personal, I'd sort of hate to have him on my trail." "That's another one of your hunches," Charlie said, in good natured banter, and they watched the 2 sheriffs ride, side by side, up the road. They had hardly disappeared around the hill when another horseman galloped into view from the opposite direction. "It's Tom Waite," said Charlie Valentine, after a moment. "How do you tell?" asked his brother. "By the way he rides, slantin'. They ain't nobody has the same seat as Tommy." "Well," murmured Louis, "I'll tell you another thing. Tom Waite is bringing us bad news." "And how'd you tell that?" Louis Valentine scratched his head. "I dunno, Charlie. Look at the way he keeps his head down, and the brim of his hat blowin' across his eyes. Take a gent that's just ridin', and he'd be ridin' with his head up. But Tom comes as if he is trying to get away from something behind him." His brother looked askance at Louis. He constantly felt his superiority as the better fighter, stronger man, sharper wit; but all of these qualities were being continually discounted by a singular power in Louis. It might have been called second sight, these odd premonitions. It often made him laughed at, ridiculed, but there was an undercurrent of respect for the superstitions of the youngest Valentine. For instance, though he was a capable bronco buster, he had been known several times to refuse positively to mount a horse considered by no means dangerous, and it had been noted, on these occasions, that the horse was exceedingly apt to develop a bad streak after Louis Valentine refused to take the saddle. Not that Louis was considered a prophet, but he was widely known as a gent that's got hunches. Accordingly, Charlie looked sideways at his younger brother on this day, and frowned uneasily. Indeed, the prophecy was instantly verified, for Tom Waite ran up the steps, and came to a panting halt before them. He wasted no words. "Charlie, you're going to Salt Springs to morrow?" "Yeah, to get that saddle I won at the bucking contest last month." "Then let me give you some advice. Keep away from Salt Springs to morrow. Keep right here at home. It ain't healthy for you to go into town." The brothers exchanged significant glances, but Louis showed no pleasure at seeing his hunch come true. "Talk sharp, Tom," said the elder of the Valentine boys. "What's up?" "The Normans are up," replied Tom Waite, drawing his first easy breath after the ride and the run up the steps. "That news ain't altogether news. Not about the Normans at the ranch, but now there's another twist to things." "Go ahead. Are they going to mob me when I come in?" "Some say that the Normans was thinking of that very thing, but they found out mighty quick that around Salt Springs we wouldn't stand for any crowd jumping on one man. No matter what you've done, Charlie, and between you and me there's a good many think you're too free with the gun play, but no matter what you've done, it's always been man to man, a clean break, and a fair chance all round." "Thanks, Tommy." "And I'm with you, solid enough. And there's a lot more of us younger gents that's all behind you. But with some of the older men, it's different. They figure that you've got a lesson coming, or something like that. The long and short of it, Charlie, is, that if somebody was to jump you single-handed, there wouldn't be many men that would go out to help you." "Thanks again," remarked Charlie coldly. "I don't ask for no help agin one man, Tommy." At this the younger fellow shook his head. "There's men and men," he said, with a probably quoted wisdom. "Stack you up agin a common kind of fighter, and you come off first rate. But there's some that makes a business of fightin'. Even with most of 'em you'd have a good chance, Charlie, 'cause you've got a good idea of the hang of a gun. You shoot fast, and you shoot straight. You got plenty of nerve, too. But there's some you wouldn't have a chance agin, and the Normans have found a gent like that." "What's his name? What's the name of this pet murderer of theirs?" asked Charlie, sneering, but a little white about the lips. "Hired murderer is the right thing to call him," said Tom Waite, "and his name is Jud Boone." He paused, expectant, and the results were not such as would disappoint him. The pallor which had begun on the face of Charlie now swept completely over it. Yet he maintained a steady front, while Louis Valentine, as though it were he whom the danger threatened, fairly collapsed against the railing of the veranda and stared at Tom Waite. For the name of Jud Boone was far known, and known as a man of evil. A fighter and gamester by instinct and profession, he was one of those men about whose past few know many details, but regarding whom there is a general murmur of suspicion. One death near Salt Springs was charged already to his account, but that one killing was the sort whose mention would strike a whole circle of men silent. "Seems he's some sort of relation to the Normans, and they've looked him up. I suppose they've paid him a bunch of money. Anyway, there's gossip around the town that the plan is for Jud Boone to be somewheres around Carroll's saloon when you go in there for the saddle, and then, of course, he'll pick a fight. So the thing for you to do is to stay home, Charlie." The latter stood motionless. Plainly he was badly frightened, but he had not yet made up his mind. It seemed that Louis was in fear of some rash decision. "Don't be a fool, now," he pleaded. "Do what Tommy says." "I don't know," muttered Charlie. "I know I got no chance agin a man like Jud Boone, but since folks expect me to be in Salt Springs to morrow, if I stay home folks will say you got good sense, that's all." "I got to see Dad about that," replied Charlie. He led the others into the house, and finding his father, he related to him briefly the news which Tom Waite had brought. In the distance Mrs. Valentine heard, and said nothing, save with her eyes. Chapter 16 "First thing," said Morgan Valentine, when the story was completed, "is this: how'd you feel about it yourself, Charlie?" His son was disturbed, and showed it. "I dunno," he said cautiously, and he watched his father with troubled eye. "Point is, if I don't go in, folks maybe will think I'm afraid of Jud Boone." "You'd be a fool if you weren't," answered his father. "I know Jud Boone. I've seen him work. I'm afraid of him myself." "Then you think I'm right to stay home?" and Charlie sighed, immensely relieved. "I leave it to you," said his father, with his usual unperturbed manner. "When it comes to life and death, every man is his own best judge." "If he was an ordinary kind of man," complained Charlie, "I'd take a chance as quick as anybody. But a professional murderer—" He shuddered. "You say you're afraid of him, and I guess it ain't wrong for me to say the same thing." "All right, son. You stay here to morrow, and I'll go in and get the saddle for you." "Dad, if you go, they'll most likely take it out on you." "Most likely they'd try to." "And you've already said that you wouldn't like to meet Jud Boone." "I wouldn't like to, but I'd do it." Silence fell on the group. Charlie Valentine moistened his colorless lips. "I'll tell you something," went on the father, in his calm manner, which had now a deadly interest for the younger men. "One time my brother John got mixed up with a ruffian in the early days." He paused to collect his thoughts, and the hush upon the others became deeper, for when Morgan Valentine, once in a year, mentioned the name of his brother, it became a breathless moment. "I forget the name of the gunfighter. It was a gent with his notches in his gun, and he was the kind that talked about 'em. Well, John crossed him. The gunman was drunk, and he was too clever to fight while he was drunk. He waited till he was all sobered up, and then he sent word to John that he was waiting for him. I was with John when the news came. Well, John waited for an hour or so, thinking. Then he sat down and wrote out his will, as good as any lawyer could have done. Then he climbed on his horse and went down to the town. I tried to go with him, but he wouldn't let me. He didn't come back that night. I waited until dark, and then I followed him. When I came to town, it was full of the fight. John had met the gunman, and the gunman had beat him to the draw. He knocked John down with the first bullet through the shoulder, the left shoulder, and while he lay on the floor he shot John again, and the bullet ripped up the flesh along his ribs. But John lay there and lifted his own gun, slow, took a good aim, and then he fired. That bullet went through the gunman's heart. There was a pause, but no one spoke, for it was evident from the lifted, tense face of Morgan Ballantyne that he would speak again. At length, "When I see John, he was pretty badly done up. He took my hand. 'Thank heaven it's over, Morgan,' he says to me. I says, 'John, it was a glorious thing to do. The whole town is talking about how brave you are.' 'It wasn't bravery, it was fear,' says John. 'I was afraid of that fellow as if he was death, but I'm more afraid of shame than I am of death.' I ain't asking you to follow the example of John, Charlie. I'm simply showing you the way one man faced the same sort of thing that you've got to face." Charlie was white, as though the bullet of Jud Boone had already pierced him. "All right," he said huskily, "then I'll—" "Don't make up your mind now," said his father gently. "Go off and sit down by yourself and think it over. If you go into Salt Springs, you'll meet Jud Boone. If you meet him, the chances are 1 out of 4 that you'll kill him, and 4 to 1 that he'll kill you. You're a young man, Charlie. You got a lot of things ahead of you. It's hard to pay that price. But keep this thing in your head, too, that if you don't meet Jud Boone, the time may come, sooner or later, when you'll have another thing to face. It may be different, and when that time comes, you may say to yourself, 'Is it worth it? Is what people may say about me worth the money that I'll have to pay to keep my name clean?' And you may remember how you kept away from Jud Boone, and then lived down the shame of it. But go off by yourself and think this thing out." He left them, and the moment he was gone, Mrs. Ballantyne, staggering, ran to her oldest son. "You ain't going to go, Charlie? Oh, tell me you ain't going to go!" He pushed her away, almost rudely. "You take my nerve when you talk like that," he said. "Give me a chance to play the man, mother. Give me a chance to think it over." He went his way, and Mrs. Ballantyne, after standing a moment with her hands clasped, looking after him, cast a frantic glance over Tom Waite and Lewis, and then hurried from the room. She had remembered that source of comfort which had many times aided her in her problems, with advice keen and to the point, even if it came out of a younger head. In a word, she went to the room of Mary Ballantyne, and there she found not only Mary, but her daughter Elizabeth. They had been laughing together, whispering over some small secret. They started up at the sight of the smaller woman. Mrs. Ballantyne hardly saw her daughter. "Mary," she said, "I've got to see you alone." And Mary took Elizabeth to the door, and then faced her aunt, turning slowly and nerving herself as if for a shock. Not that there was an actual anger existing between the two, but each was from a separate world, and they always looked on one another as from a distance. Mary now was forcing a faint smile of interest, but Mrs. Ballantyne was too distressed to even pretend to disguise her emotion. "Like as not," she said, and her voice was softer than her words were bitter, "like as not, Elizabeth has been telling you things that only her mother should know. I give you my word, Aunt Maud, that if there were anything really important about it, I'd tell you myself." The wan smile of Aunt Maud had no mirth in it. "It's the same with Elizabeth as it is with the boys. You come first, Mary, and you come first with Morgan, I think." "Hush, hush! What are you saying?" "A man likes spirit, decision, all the things that you have and that I haven't." "Aunt Maud!" "It's true. You see, I've watched and understood. They come to me just to be around, but when it's a big happiness, or maybe a secret, or maybe a sorrow, then they go to you. As if they felt I couldn't hold a big thing.
I'm only a shock absorber. I simply take the shock of silly things that would bother you." "Ah, Mary," said Mrs. Valentine, and she made a singular gesture of drawing imperceptible things toward her heart, "don't you know that a mother wants to be troubled by them that she loves? You'll know some day, Mary. The treasures of a woman are the troubles that her family bring to her. It's her secret life. I've got no such life, Mary. They pass by me. They go to you." Mary Valentine watched the head of her aunt bow with grief. She made a little movement, as though she would go to her and strive to cherish her, but the movement was checked. Between the two was a barrier which even the smiles of Mary, and all her ways, could not break down. "I don't complain," said her aunt, faintly. "After all, I suppose it's the call of blood to blood. You're a Valentine, and I'm just about nothing. I'm on the outside. But I haven't come to rake up old troubles. I don't know why I always say these things to you, Mary. You've been fair and square to me, honey.
You've never gone about behind my back. You've never repeated things. You've never tried to make bad blood between me and the rest. And Lord knows you could have done it many a time. There ain't a small part about you, Mary. And now I've come. The way Elizabeth comes to you, and the way Morgan comes to you, and the way Charlie and Louis come to you, I've come to ask your help, Mary." After what she had said before, there could not have been a sadder confession. "It's about Charlie. The old trouble that started over Joe Norman. Now the Normans have hired Jud Boone, and he's going to lay for Charlie when Charlie goes into Salt Springs to get the prize saddle to-morrow. Then it all comes back to me. It was for my sake that Charlie fought Joe Norman. But I'm not casting that in your face. I'm only asking you what we can do, Mary." "Sit down. You're all of a tremble. Sit down. Here, let me hold your hands. Is that better?" "Yes, you sort of steady me, Mary." "I'll tell you what we must do. We must keep Charlie at home." "I thought of that. Everybody thought of that first thing. But Morgan won't have it that way." "His own father?" "He says it better to die than to be shamed." "Ah, that sounds like him. But I'll go and try to persuade him." At this Aunt Maud winced. "You could always do more with him than anybody else could, Mary. But this time you can't budge, Morgan. Because he's following an example." "Whose?" "Your father's, dear." The girl was silent. "But you'll try to think of something to do, Mary? You'll try to find some way to keep Charlie from Jud Boone? Ain't there anybody among all the men you know that could help Charlie? You could ask someone. Morgan wouldn't lift his finger to get help." Mary Valentine sat very stiff and straight in her chair, and stared fixedly at her window, as though she saw a ghost forming against the bright rectangle. "I've thought of a thing to do," she said at last. "It won't be easy. Maybe it won't work. But I'll try." End of chapter 15 and 16. Chapters 17 and 18 of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Silence lay over the house of Morgan Valentine. No one had asked Charlie for his ultimate decision, but Louis stole down to the family that afternoon and reported that Charlie was in his room upstairs working busily over 2 revolvers, oiling them, cleaning them, testing their balance with nervous care. That report was more forcible than the most violent affirmation on the part of young Valentine of his determination to face Jud Boone and fight him man to man. Even the hand of Morgan Valentine was unsteady as he lighted his pipe. His wife had dropped her head upon her hands with a moan, and Elizabeth cried out. One would have thought that a death had been announced. But as for Mary, she still turned in her mind the gambling chance which she had determined to take. It was no less than a purpose of leaving the house and going to Salt Springs to speak with Dan Carroll, and through him send to the outlaw Jess Dreer an appeal for help. Yet it was not easy to do this. If she stated that she wished to go to town, some one of the family would accompany her; and if she wished to see Dan Carroll, questions would certainly be asked. For the repute of Carroll was a sooty one, and contaminated all who touched him. Even if she slipped away during the day and reached Salt Springs unknown to the family, it would be impossible to see Carol without letting half of Salt Springs know to whom she made her visit. Not that she really cared what public opinion murmured about her, but if her visit were a public matter, there was very little chance that Carol would tell her where she could find Jess Dreer. It was a trip that must be completed between dark and dawn, and for this she laid her plans. One thing favored her: the family did not sit up late in the living room, for it was a gloomy matter to stare from face to face, and read in each eye the same foreboding which filled one's own mind. Mrs. Valentine, close to tears, was the first to leave. Then Charley, who had remained white-faced, sullenly defiant, apparently decided that he dare not risk the complete breakdown of his nerves. He rose, muttered his good night huskily, and hurried from the room. The others trooped away one by one, leaving Morgan Valentine alone beside the fire. The report of Lewis had made him show one touch of emotion, but neither before nor since had he appeared to be in the slightest degree concerned. As soon as she was in her room, Mary hurried into her riding clothes before she put out the light and crept into bed, for she feared that visitors might come, and they did. First Elizabeth, and then Mrs. Valentine came in and leaned over her; but when she heard the regular breathing, she apparently decided that the girl was asleep. She leaned and touched Mary's forehead with her lips, and then stole from the room. Mary was deeply moved, for it had been years since her aunt had showed any true affection; and when, a little after this, the house was quiet, she got up, pressed her hat on her head, and slipped out by the rear of the house. 5 minutes later she was speeding down the road on her sturdy little Morgan mare, docile as a pet dog and durable as leather. Midnight brought her to Salt Springs, with the dust of the street squirting up around the hoofs of the mare. She rode on between the rows of black, silent houses until she was close to Carol's place. Then she swung her horse between two dwellings, and came out directly in the rear of the big saloon. The midnight of Salt Springs was the noon of Dan Carroll. His saloon burst with light and voices, and through the open windows, across the shafts of light, clouds of tobacco smoke rose, cut briefly away by the darkness. But how could she come to Dan Carroll? A man came to the screen door at the rear of the building and opened it. She saw the faint arc of light as he tossed his cigarette butt away. "Halloo!" called Mary, roughening her voice. "Send Danny out to me, will you?" "Can't you walk?" cried the man, who apparently did not recognize the voice of a woman. "Go get him yourself, son." She waited. A skulking figure slipped out of the darkness and hurried across the open toward the gaming house. She reined her mare across and touched his shoulder with her quirt. At that the man leaped sideways, very agile. He was a small fellow. "Partner," said Mary, "I've got a word to say to Dan Carroll. Will you take it in to him?" "Me?" said a harsh, shrill voice, the voice of a Chinaman. "Dan Carroll?" "Never mind," and she reined her horse back, for she had recognized the accent of Kong Lee, her father's cook. This was the explanation, then, of Kong's periods of sudden affluence and sudden poverty. But now the little man followed her. "Never mind," she repeated, "I don't need you." "Miss Mary!" said the Chinaman, whining his astonishment. "Miss Mary!" She writhed in the saddle. To be recognized in full daylight would have been bad enough, but to be recognized at the door of Carroll's gaming house and saloon in the middle of night was infinitely worse. "Listen to me, Kong Lee," she said fiercely. "I have to see Dan Carroll. I want to see that he's brought out here, but I don't want you to tell him my name before any other man. Understand?" "I savvy." "And if you ever tell any one that I've been here, I'll tie you by your queue to the limb of a tree till you starve to death, Kong Lee. Understand?" "I savvy," said Kong, and he shuddered. It was not the first time in her life that Mary had threatened him, and he considered her quite capable of anything she named. "But," he murmured, "Dan Carroll very bad man, Miss Mary." "Don't I know that? I'll take care of myself. You hurry along." He hesitated a moment longer, but dread of Miss Mary's tongue at length made him whirl and shuffle away toward the gaming house. At the door he paused and looked back again, but he went on, the screen door banging loudly behind him. There followed a long pause. Her mind filled up the vacancy of Kong Lee approaching the table of the gambler, touching his arm, and being cursed for a no-good Chink. But eventually there was a sound of scuffling, the screen door burst violently open, and Kong Lee leaped from the lighted interior into the darkness, sprawling, his arms and legs stretched out before him, and the pigtail whipped straight out behind. Dan Carroll sprang into the doorway and poured a hurricane of abuse and profanity after his victim, while Kong Lee darted by, crying to Mary as he passed, "Bad man, very bad man, Miss Mary." "Mr. Carroll," called the girl, guarding her voice. Carroll fell silent. At the very sound of the voice he had touched the hat which was never off his head. Now he stepped cautiously outside. There were 100 men who would have welcomed a chance to shoot Carroll securely by night. "Who's there?" She rode close to him. "I suppose you know me, but my name really doesn't matter. I've come on important business, Mr. Carroll." Slowly he took off his hat and spun it in his hands. She could feel his astonishment even though darkness quite covered his face. "You're Mary Valentine." "Hush! I am Mary Valentine. I want you to tell me where to find Jess Dreer. Can you?" The gambler started, drew back, and then stepped close to the horse. "How should I know Jess Dreer?" he muttered very softly. "You mean the outlaw?" "He said you did." Carroll drew in his breath with a hissing sound. "Dreer said that?" "He did." "Well, he lied. That's straight talk, and it's true. What would I be doing with Dreer, eh?" "He's a man whom I am proud to know," said the girl. "Does that make it any easier for you to talk?" "Listen," said Carroll. "The gent that knows where Jess Dreer is can take down several thousand for telling the sheriff. There's a price on him that would stock a ranch." "That," said she, "is the reason why he can't trust any except men who are above money, Mr. Carroll. Will you tell me where he is?" "Did he say I was above money?" asked the gambler curiously, after a pause. "He didn't, but he said you could send me to him, and I infer the rest of it." "You infer too much. I can't do it." "I thought that perhaps you couldn't, so I've written out what I have to say to him. I have it here in this envelope. If I give it to you, do you think that you could get it to Jess Dreer?" "I don't know nothing about him." "Of course you don't." She extended the letter. "But maybe you'd keep it for him, on the chance that he might call in some day." "I don't know anything about him," repeated the gambler. "But if you ask me to keep this for you, why, I'll hang on to it." "Thank you, and good night. One thing, Mr. Carroll. I haven't seen you to night. Lady, the gent that was to say that you'd seen me to night would have to chew up his talk and swaller it again. Good night, and good luck." And he remained standing with his hat in his hand until she was gone into the darkness with a quick patter of hoofs. Chapter 18 In the days of his youth, someone in the midst of a barroom brawl had stood on Dan Carroll's nose, and the result was that the rest of his life it remained sadly crushed in the centre. The nostrils flared out disagreeably from the same cause, over a wide, thin-lipped, sinister mouth, and just such a jaw as brings admiration to the bull terrier. For Dan Carroll was the fighting type. Not brawny, but his body made up for flesh by bones and sinews. When he turned his head, the cords stood out on his neck. In spite of his little more than average weight, there were tales of Dan Carroll performing prodigious feats of strength. In fact, he rarely used a gun in the brawls that often developed in his barroom, but was far more apt to trust to his naked hands. And it was known that more than one obstreperous drunkard, no matter what his size, had been lifted and swung crashing through the swinging doors of Dan's domain. He was not a pretty man to look at. Aside from his ugly face, his shoulders sloped forward so as to give an unhealthy look to his chest, and he was remarkably bow-legged. When most kids was flat on their backs, sucking their thumbs, Dan used to say, I was on my feet trying to get places. That's how I come to overstrain my legs." Dan's moral character was as deformed as his body; but it would require a book by itself to deal with his past, and as for the name of Dan Carroll in Salt Springs, it was an offense. However, so long as no one aired his opinion in the hearing of Dan Carroll, he was indifferent to private judgments. He was known to run the squarest game in Salt Springs, and to sell the cleanest liquor, and for that reason his prosperity waxed, and his purse grew fat. As he passed through the rooms with the letter stuffed into his hip pocket, some one hailed him to rejoin the game which he had just left, but he consigned them to another table, and went on. To the second story of his rambling building he climbed, and came to a room in the rear, with this sign in great letters upon it: "Store room, keep out." Upon this he tapped. 3 short taps, a pause, and then 3 more. Whereupon, after a moment's pause, but with no preliminary sound of the knob being turned, the door was opened swiftly. There was no sign of an occupant at first, though the storeroom was fitted up as a bedroom, and the cigarette smoke was still curling slowly from an ash tray toward the shaded lamp. But as Dan Carroll stepped in, the inhabitant, who had been standing directly behind the door, now closed it and turned to his host. It was Jess Dreer. "Neat little trick, that," said Dan Carroll. "Sit down," Jess invited. "I ain't got a minute. I've been wondering if you're getting lonely up here." "Me? I'm never lonely. Besides, I hear the boys soaking up the laughter and the booze downstairs, and I enjoy a jag at second hand. It's cheaper, and it don't give you no morning after." "That's the first economical thing I ever heard you say." "Well, Jess, it's a shame you can't pry your way downstairs and take in some of the loose coin. It's floating in oceans. I hate to take it away. They come up and pour it into my pockets." "I don't have to play with the crowd," murmured Jess. "I got it down to a finer system. You take the stuff from the boys, and then I get it from you. Nothing easier or simpler, Dan." The face of the gambler clouded, and he cast an expressive glance at the table, as though it recalled gloomy scenes to him. "You got all the luck," he declared, "that a man was ever born with." "Nope," said Jess. "I work on a system." "What?" His eyes gleamed while he asked. "I wait for a hunch, and then plunge to the limit." The gambler leaned back with a growl of disgust. "Well, if you're all right up here, I'll go back." "Go ahead. But first, ain't you forgetting something?" Dan Carroll squinted narrowly at his friend, for of all the men in the world he would perhaps have named Jess Dreer first in this capacity. "What do you mean?" he asked sharply. "I mean, ain't you forgot the thing that brought you up here? Talk short. What's up?" "A girl come here and wanted to see you, Jess." "She's here?" cried the big man, in an indescribable tone. "She was here." "Carroll, you turned her away?" There was something so sinister in his manner, so quietly grim, that the gambler gave back a little. "Partner, would you have wanted me to bring her in, where a dozen men might have seen her, where there'd been 100 chances for folks to start talking about her? This ain't no ladies' seminary where they can come calling, is it?" At this, Jess Dreer wiped his forehead. "You're right. She give me this letter for you, Jess." He extended the letter, and then, a rare act of delicacy, lest he should see an unwonted emotion in the face of the big man, Carroll bowed his head and left the room, without another glance at his guest. But Jess Dreer, when the door closed, stood for a long moment with the letter unopened. At length, nervously, he ripped the envelope open, and shook out the folded paper. He read: "Dear Jess Dreer, I thought at the time that it was not a farewell, but I never dreamed that I would have to remember your offer. And now I have to come to you for help. I have thought and thought, but there is really nobody else. Others might be willing to try, but you are the only one who could accomplish it. It is an ugly thing out of my past. I hurt the feelings of young Joe Norman, and he said something indiscreet about me, and my cousin, Charlie Valentine, shot him, only a slight wound. The Normans were furious.
They had no one to put up against Charlie, so they hunted until they found a professional fighter, the low cowards, and that man is the notorious Jud Boone. Charlie has got to go to Salt Springs to morrow for a saddle he won in the bucking contest, and the plan, as we hear it, is for Jud Boone to meet him and bring on a fight. What can I do? You see that Charlie is really in grave danger for my sake, for it all began with me. If I were a man... But I'm not a man, and I have to turn to the bravest and strongest man I know, and appeal to Jess Dreer for help. Can you stop Jud Boone before he murders Charlie? Mary Valentine.
End of chapters 17 and 18. Chapters 19 and 20 of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. The whole theory of Dreer's strategy in remaining in Salt Springs was the theory of the rabbit which cowers in a hole while the hunters sweep on along the probable trail. But if the rabbit raises its head before the hunt has driven by, its trick is worse than useless, it is suicidal. And if Jess Dreer, while half a dozen head hunters were scouring distant mountains around Salt Springs in pursuit of him, should appear in the center of danger, he would be fully in the role of the silly rabbit. Yet he was called upon to act, and from the first moment of that call he had not the slightest hesitancy. The only question was, how he should strike at Jud Boone. One possibility presented itself at once. Aside from the people on the Valentine ranch, and they would not be apt to be in Salt Springs, there was only one man who was apt to recognize him, and that was the sheriff of the Southland, Caswell. Suppose, therefore, that he boldly walked into the bar of Carroll's saloon at the time when Charlie Valentine arrived for the saddle, and, if matters reached a crisis, stepped between Charlie and danger. The repute of Jud Boone had reached his ears even in the distant South, yet he was perfectly willing to take a chance against the bad man. The thing that troubled him was that if he entered into a shooting fracas with Boone, he would certainly be detained for an inquiry after the affair was over, and in that case Caswell or someone else was certain to recognize him. It was suicidal, therefore, to face Boone in the saloon. It remained to stop him before he entered the saloon, and that was the plan of the outlaw. The first thing he had done when he took refuge with Carroll was to secure from the gambler a rudely sketched map of Salt Springs, the trails around it and the location, and the alleys branching from the main street, as well as a position of each house and the name of the owner, a task far from complicated. To this plan he now had reference, and having located his goal, he left his room. It was not difficult to escape from Carroll's gambling house without attracting attention. In the first place, the men within the building were occupied with interesting affairs of their own. In the second place, there was an easy back door for Jess Dreer. He had only to slip from his window out onto the broad shelving roof. Along this he worked to the lowest corner over the rear of the house, and having made sure that no one was in sight, he dropped noiselessly to the ground, and remained where he fell, bunched and moveless, while he examined again everything around him. No living thing moved within range of his eye. Behind him the gaming house still bustled softly with humming voices and the occasional clink of glasses. But all the rest of Salt Springs was gathered in a black sleep. So he went boldly down the main street until, coming opposite the house he wanted, he walked to the front door of it and knocked. Luckily there was someone still up even at this hour, for a light flickered yellow in an upper window. In answer to the knock, after a moment, a window was flung up noisily. Jess Dreer stepped back from the flat face of the shack, for in spite of its 2 stories there was no sign of a veranda, and he could look straight up to the second level of the building. There he saw that the window had been opened in the lighted room, but the occupant was not standing in view. he remained to one side, and his bulky shadow wavered across the curtain above him. "Who's there?" he called in a rather guarded voice. "A friend, with news." "Who do you want to see?" Dreer made swift calculations, and then took his chance. "Why, I want to see you, Judd." A silence. He could not tell how that announcement was taken, and yet by the change in the shadow he had no doubt that the other was striving to reconnoitre the midnight visitor, and at the same time remain himself in covert. Law-abiding citizens were not apt to show such remarkable discretion, and Dreer's belief that his guess was right was growing stronger, when the voice went on: "Well, and who are you that wants to see me?" "Look down," said Jess, knowing perfectly that the other could not distinguish his face by the starlight. "Look down, and you'll recognize me, Judd." "I ain't a bat. How can I see in the dark? What's your name?" "Don't you even know my voice?" said Jess in aggrieved tones. "Then let me come up and surprise you, Judd." The other did not reply for a moment. Then he reached a decision. "Come to morrow. Too late now. Come to morrow." "Whist!" Jess Dreer whispered. He stepped closer to the wall, and cupped his hand about his whisper. "To morrow'll be too late, Judd." At this the shadow swerved on the curtain. Then a whisper answered: "Come on up, partner. The front door's open. This end of the hall. Door on the right." So Jess Dreer entered the house, and went up hurriedly over the uncarpeted stairs that creaked at every step, and down the hall until he tapped at the designated door. "Come in," said the other. And Jess, entering, found on the other side of the room a blocky fellow, prematurely bald, perhaps 35 years old, with the small, chunky hands and the little feet which often denote a man of agility. He stood beyond a little deal table, with his hands resting lightly on his hips, and an expression of face and attitude which betokened the utmost readiness for action. All of these things Jess Dreer noted with a familiar eye, and while he closed the door without turning away from the stranger, he allowed a broad grin to spread over his face. The hands of Jud Boone slipped a little farther down his thighs. "A fake, eh?" he said grimly. "It's the first time, Jud, that I've ever been called a fake. And who the devil might you be?" "My name is something that I handle real tender. As a matter of fact, of late years, every time I have to mention my name, I most generally have got to mention my gun at the same time. You know how it is." This amiability seemed by no means to the liking of Jud Boone. He studied his man from beneath a deepening frown, and by the twitching of his lips it was easy to see that he was of two minds whether to pitch the stranger headlong through the door, or let him continue to talk. Perhaps it was the width of the shoulders of Jess that discouraged the first notion. "I don't know nothing," averred Jud Boone, "but I'd like to know what you want out of me." "Talk," said Jess, helping himself to a chair by hooking a foot under it and swinging it dexterously behind him. "Talk is my prime reason for coming here, Jud." "You know me, huh?" "I never seen you before," said Jess, smiling again. The face of the other grew tense for an instant. He made half a step sideways toward the window, and then seemed to realize that he could not look out of it without relinquishing his watch upon his visitor. "I ain't got any friends with me," said Jess, "if that's what's bothering you. I ain't got the sheriff down below waiting for me to bring you out." "And what's any sheriff got to do with me, "I leave that to you," said Jess, with a careless gesture. But the gesture was with his left hand, the right remained resting easily upon his thigh. All of which Jud Boone took into careful consideration. "Come short with me, stranger," he said. "What do you want? I'm a tolerable peevish man, and I need sleep just now." "I'm agreeable. What I want is a promise." Jud Boone gasped. "If I had my pick between a million and a nerve like yours," he declared with wondering admiration, "I dunno which I'd take. You want a promise out of me?" "Gentleman's agreement. I want you to keep your hands off Charlie Valentine when he comes in to morrow." "They's been a lot of fool talk floating around this town," declared the gunman, "about what I figure on with Charlie Valentine. I ain't never seen him, and I don't never want to. But first I want to know what is the point you knife in it." "Judd, I'll tell you. I'll double the ante you got from the Normans. I'll give you $1,000 in cold cash, if you just fade out of Salt Springs and make no noise." In response, the latter merely stared with narrowed eyes. "I see," nodded Jess. "You ain't so cheap as I figured. What's your price?" "I dunno what you mean," declared Jud Boone. "But if I did know, I reckon I'd have to bust you in two, pardner, and throw the loose ends out the window." "If that's the way of it," and Jess smiled, "then maybe you know enough. Think again, Jud. What's your price?" "I'll tell you the price of a whole hide for you," said the gunfighter, "and that's to get up and back out of this joint mighty quick. I'm tired of your funny chatter, friend." "My money won't talk?" "It don't." "My, now we're getting real cross. But listen to reason. You get hired for one job, to bump off Valentine, but now it's a different job. You got two men on your hands." "Meanin' you're the other?" "Meanin' just that." "And do you think that'd stop me, partner?" "That's what I think." He lowered his voice to the volume of a whisper. "I'm drear, Jud." Chapter 20 It caused an astonishing change in the face of the other. Drear saw a desperate thought balancing in the eyes of Boone, but then the glitter died away. It was a slow death, and for a time either fought the other with his eyes. Just as two men try grips until the hand of one weakens, crumbles. In such a manner the nerve of Jud Boone, keyed up to the point of fighting, broke and weakened. In the first moment, had Jess Dreer made the slightest motion toward a weapon, gunplay would have resulted, and Dreer knew it perfectly well. His hands did not stir, but the faint sneer was stamped upon his face, and his eyes never wavered until the mouth of Jud Boone sagged open a little, and his glance grew dull. "You're Dreer?" he said huskily. "I'm Dreer." Jud Boone raised an uncertain hand and wiped his dry lips. Then he shrugged his shoulders and managed to chuckle. "I might have known you," he said, with an attempt at cheeriness. "As a matter of fact, I've heard old Tom Lassand talk a pile about you. Put her there." He crossed the room with a swagger and extended a hand, which Dreer instantly took. But on the part of Boone it was unconditional surrender, and both men knew it. Just as some promising prize fighter, who would beat an ordinary man to a pulp, is suddenly frozen to helplessness when he is placed in the ring with a champion in his class, so Boone collapsed under the eye of his companion. And he hated Dreer for his superiority. "What I don't figure," he said, "is why you didn't tell me your name the minute you come in." "I knew I could trust you, Jud," the other lied smoothly, "but I've sort of formed a habit of keeping my name in the dark. Mostly it don't do no good, but a lot of harm. You know how it is." "Sure. Have a drink?" "I'm keeping clear of the booze, thanks." Jud Boone flushed, and then sat down in turn. During the rest of the talk his eyes were mostly lowered, only flashing up for an instant at the face of Dreer when the latter spoke. "Now we'll talk turkey. Let's go back to the matter of the coin, Jud. I know how it is. A gent will get in a hole so that he needs a bit of coin, and—" "Money ain't got nothin' to do with it," cried Jud Boone. He writhed in his chair. "I'll tell you the straight of it. I'm bustin' loose from the old game, Dreer. You know me. You know I ain't been any little tin angel, but you don't have anything on me, nothin' cold. They ain't a man living that could put me behind the bars." How many of the dead could have given that evidence, was the thought of Jess Dreer. "And now I've found some blood kin of mine, these Normans. They want me to settle down with them. They need me, and if I'm to go straight, I need them. It ain't easy to go straight. A gent's past is apt to come up and turn him wrong any time. Besides—" he choked. "There's a girl, Jud?" suggested Jess Dreer, with singular emotion. "Maybe," admitted the other, flushing. "Here's my point. This Charlie Valentine is a bad one. He's got the makings of a gunman. He ought to be stopped before he gets going real good. You see?" He was arguing desperately, and Jess Dreer sat back with a vague pity beginning to work in his heart, pity and contempt. This hardened rascal to talk of stopping the career of a gunfighter! But he saw that there was a grain of sincerity buried in the talk of Jud Boone. The man meant it. He wanted to go straight, and to break away from his past. The whole story came out as he talked. He had been passing through that section of the country. He had stopped in at the house of Joel Norman, a distant cousin. He had fallen desperately in love with Joel's daughter May. The girl had liked him, she had shown it, and he had tried to play the game straight by going to Joel and asking his consent to the marriage. But Joel put him away with horror. And Jud Boone left the country with hatred for his whole clan in his heart. Then they sent after him, and Joel put up the proposition to him. He was to right the affair of Valentine and avenge the shooting of Joe Norman. That done, no cash would change hands, but Jud, if May was still willing, could marry her and settle down on a piece of land which Joel would stock for him. His past would be forgotten. The family power of the Normans would be used to the utmost to restore Jud's standing as a law-abiding citizen. Not that this tale flowed smoothly from the lips of Jud. It came brokenly, illuminating phrases told whole episodes in a second. "That's how I'm fixed," he concluded. "I don't aim to kill Valentine. I just want to—" "Wait a minute," said Jess Dreer. "If Charlie was a common cowhand, you wouldn't need to kill him. You could drill him through an arm or a leg and let him go. But he ain't that kind. He's a fast boy, Jud, and you know what that means just as well as I know. If you meet him, you'll have to shoot to kill. So would I if I met him. Just the same as we'd have to shoot to kill if we got tangled up with each other." Once more Jud Boone met the eye of Dreer and quailed. "Put it short," he said at length. "How far'll you go for this Valentine?" "To the limit." "They must have paid you high," said Jud bitterly. "There's no other way out?" "There ain't a single way. We gotta give way, one of us, Jud, and that one ain't goin' to be me." A gray color invaded the face of Jud Boone. He rose slowly from his chair, with his arms dangling stiffly at his sides. "Dreer, I can't step out. I've give my word, and I'd rather go to hell than to face her after running out on my promise." He swayed himself a little back and forth, and set his teeth. With every scruple of energy in his soul and body, he was striving to call up the fighting passion, but the result was only a dull glare, and the mouth of the gunfighter was twitching loosely. "If you're going to stop me, Dreer, you got to stop me now." The sneer deepened on the thin lips of Dreer. "You poor fool," he said contemptuously. "Look down at your hand. A Chinaman could beat you to your own gun, Boone, and shoot you full of holes." As one fascinated by a superior power, Boone looked down, saw the quaking fingers of his hands, and dropped back in his chair. His face was buried, and he groaned. Jess Dreer walked to him and touched the trembling, massive shoulders. The gunfighter dared not look up. "Listen to me, Jud. I'm sorry for you. I ain't your confessor, but I tell you I've heard some awful things about you, and about what you done to your partner that found that claim for you back of Angelville. About a pile of other things I've heard, too. But I'll say now that I don't believe 'em. I'm going to do my part by you. How do I know that this Charlie Valentine is enough of a man to be worth all this trouble and pain saving? Maybe in a pinch he'd show yeller. I've seen it done. He's done nothing but clean up on a bunch of kids. How'd he act facing a real fighting gent like you? That's the question. Well, Jud, we'll try him out. You go to that saloon to-morrow, and you hang around until Charlie Valentine comes in. Then give him a try. Walk up to him and see if he's got the nerve to meet you. Laugh at him, mock him, tell him what you're going to do in the line of filling him full of lead, and when you're done with that, just tell him to get out of the saloon. And then stand still and look him in the eye. There ain't one chance in 10 that he'll come through. Most likely he'll try to grin and then back out. And if he does that, you're through. You've done your part better than the Normans could have asked, because you'll have shamed the boy. Ay, it would be worse than shooting him in a way, but I'll stand by and give you the chance. And I tell you straight, it costs me more'n you'd guess to do it. But you go ahead. Try his nerve. But if he don't buckle and quit, if he don't walk out of the saloon, if he stands ready for a fight, then, Judd, you won't be fighting him, you'll be fighting me. Because I'll be standing by, and the minute the test comes, I'm going to call your name out, and you and me'll finish what you and him begun." "Do you mean it?" cried Jud Boone, leaping to his feet, exultant. "I mean it." "But how can you stand around in Carroll's place? What have you seen?" "I won't be seen, but I'll be seeing. Then, partner, you'll see this Charlie Valentine crumple up like wet paper when I get my eye on him, and I know how to work it." His face went savage. Indeed, he had had a practical demonstration that night of the power which one eye may exert upon another. "There's one thing more," said Jess Dreer slowly. "You know my name. You know I'm wanted. If you was to spread the news around that I was in town, it might be kind of bad for me. I'll leave it to your honor, Jud." "Give me your hand," cried Jud. "You've met me halfway, and you can trust me to go square with you, partner. So long, then." And the outlaw backed to the door, waving his hand, and was gone. End of chapters 19 and 20. Chapters 21 and 22 of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. But the moment he was alone, shame threw Jud Boone into a perfect frenzy of rage and self-hatred. He ran to the door with the revolver naked in his hand, as if even now he would call back Dreer and face him. But he heard the door close downstairs, and he hurried back to the window. Across the street below him the tall figure was passing, and he raised his weapon for a chance shot, balanced it a moment, and then dropped it into the holster with a groan. He sank into a chair, grinding his knuckles into his forehead, then leaped up as though under a spur, and paced the room. But the thought of Jess Dreer followed him like a ghost, and like a ghost kept the calm eye upon him. At length he made up his mind. It was a shameful thing, perhaps, to betray the word which he had pledged to Jess Dreer, but to Jud Boone this was a matter of life and death, and where he was vitally concerned he had never been in the habit of consulting the requirements of honour. He went straight to the bedroom of his host, Saul Norman, and slipped in without knocking at the door. He found the lamp on the table by dint of fumbling, and lighted it, looking up to find Saul Norman rising in bed on one elbow, and blinking rapidly in the light. Saul Norman was prodigiously long of nose and chin, and was considered the saddest faced man on the ranges. His face was now even longer than usual, while he gaped at the gunfighter. "The game's off," declared Jud, frowning at the other. "What game?" "Me and Charlie Valentine. I'm through." At this Saul Norman swung out of bed, and plunged his bony legs into trousers. Saul was preeminently a man of action. Half a minute later he was strapping on a gun, and all these vital seconds he had not asked a single question. "Now," he said, catching up his hat, "what's wrong?" "I took on one man, not two," declared the gunman sullenly. "I took on Charlie Valentine for you folks. You all figured that Charlie was too fast with his gun for any of you to tackle, and I was willing to have a try at him. But the new man—" "What new man?" "Jess Dreer." There was a foul oath from Saul Norman. "What's he got to do with it?" "This: that if I jump Charlie, Dreer will jump me." 2 to 1, eh? Don't worry, Jud. That's just what we want. If we can get this down to mob action, everything is dead easy. We got the numbers." Jud Boone flushed. "It ain't the numbers, Saul. He ain't going to work with Charlie. He'll work by himself." "Then you'll send him the same way you send Charlie Valentine, Jud, and you'll collect the price for him. Not a bad day's work, eh?" He made his voice hearty as he said this, but Jud failed to show enthusiasm. He flushed as he approached the shameful truth. "Saul, don't you know nothin' about Jess Dreer?" "Well?" "He's the fastest man with a gun that ever sunk a spur into a hoss, Saul. Why, it was him that killed Salty Moore. And I've seen Salty work." He had turned gray while he recalled Salty, and now Sol Norman nodded slowly. He understood. "But there's one way round it. We'll keep Drear from comin' anywheres near Carroll's saloon. He's an outlaw. Nobody don't need to wait for an invitation before they plug Drear. We'll pass the word around. We'll get all our boys out with somethin' on the hip." Jud Boone mopped his forehead. "It's a rotten job," he muttered. "I don't feel no ways right about it. Keep him away if you can, but somehow I figure he'll get through. He'll be somewheres near, watchin' when I face Charlie Valentine, but have a drink," urged Sol, studying the face of the fighter with his little shrewd eyes. "Have a drink. Then you tumble into bed and have a snooze. I'm going to make the rounds and get the boys together. They'd be on hand anyway. I'm going to make sure of having 'em here early. But what does this Drear look like? I've never seen him. None of the rest of the boys have. He's tall, big shoulders, narrow waist, long arms, like a gorilla. He ain't very good to look at, kind of lean in the face, got a straight looking eye." He shuddered slightly as he remembered that eye. He concluded, "You just tell the boys what I've told you, and when they see Jess Drear, they'll know him well enough." He stepped closer and clutched the arms of Sol with his pudgy hands. "Sol, you got to keep him away." And he turned to the whiskey bottle. Sol Norman left the room with 3 huge strides, went down the stairs with as many leaps, and burst into the night on his errand; and Jud Boone, turning the whiskey glass nervously, was comforted by the beat of hoofs that swept down the street. There was no sleep for Jud that night. Most of the time he spent in recalling the most minute details of his interview with Drear, and then he focused the eye of the memory on the personal appearance of the outlaw, and most of all he dwelt upon the long, capable, deft fingers of the man. In those fingers a revolver would become a living thing, he felt. In the meantime, before dawn was well up in the sky, the first arrivals appeared at the house of Sol Norman, for this was the rallying place for the clan; and their coming also cheered Jud Boone. He could hear the front door slamming more and more frequently, and their noisy stamping through the lower hall to the kitchen. When he went down, they gave him a noisy reception. He was their champion, and they treated him like a king. Eagerly, to the circle of attentive faces, Jud described the outlaw, and the necessity of keeping him away from the saloon. They were to shoot at sight, ask their questions later, for if Drear ever got the drop on them, or even a fair warning of his danger, he would probably escape through 1,000 of them. Jud was willing to exaggerate the prowess of Drear; it made his fear of the outlaw less cowardly, and more like a man's dread of any power in nature. Jess Drear became, under his painting, a cyclone against which one man, or even 2, would be foolish to stand; and the result of the speech was that every man of the Norman clan looked to his weapon, and then went out prepared for desperate battle. By the time it was full day, they had already laid their preparations and their plans of battle; and by the time it was full day, Dan Carroll went up to the room of Drear. The big man, like Jud Boone, had not slept during the small remainder of the night, and at a signal from the gambler he went to the window. "Look yonder." "Well?" asked Jess Drear. "What do you see?" "A bald old boy scratching his head. That bald old boy is Tom Norman, the old man himself." He led the way to another window. "What'd you see?" "Why, the same thing you do 3 gents sitting on a log playing dice. Them 3 are Walter Norman and his 2 cousins, Gary and Wally. Now, Jess, do you begin to do a little thinking?" "I begin to think that they's a considerable heap of Normans in this town. Anything else I'd ought to think?" "Why d'you think they're here?" "Why, they're going to hang round and wait for the fight to come off. They're waiting to see Jud Boone kill Charlie Valentine. Wouldn't take much brains to figure that out. Don't it strike you that they're a wee mite early? They don't want to get caught in the rush. Go on, Danny, and tell me what it all means, if it does mean anything queer." "Kind of queer, pardner. Them gents ain't the only ones. There's others all around the saloon. They're sitting on front porches. They're loafing around in the alleys. There's a couple of 'em down in the barroom now.
not talking much, just standing and sipping their drink like they didn't like it, and looking, Jesse. They're out there to keep you from going to the saloon." It made the outlaw whirl on him. "What the devil do they mean by that?" "They's a whisper going arounds that you intend to show up, and when it comes to the pinch between Judd and Charley Valentine, you're going to step in and take a crack at Judd. There ain't anything in it, Jess, is there?" The tall man was stunned, but he gradually recovered. "It's Boone," he said, huskily. "The skunk has started talking. He gave his word. Danny, I could have killed the hound dog, and got away clean without nobody knowing I was ever near him, and now he's double-crossed me." "He told what?" gasped Carroll. "Do you mean to say that you were going to step in between Boone and young Valentine?" "I was, and I am." "Jess, you're hanging yourself." "I'd only be hurrying up something that's sure to happen sooner or later, but I still got one chance." "What's that?" "If I can get back to my room after the fracas." "No good, Jess. They'll search every inch of the house." "That's right." He fell silent. "There's only one chance, then. If I have to make a play agin Jud Boone with all the gang around, I'm done. But if Jud bluffs down Charley, why, then my neck's saved." "But what'll I do? Where can I help, Jess?" "Nothing you can do. These here things, Danny, just up and happens." Chapter 22 Public opinion in Salt Springs was strictly neutral. On the one hand, it was felt that Charley Valentine had overstepped the bounds within which a peaceful man should walk by his various shooting scrapes. On the other hand, there were not many who entirely approved of the Normans. They were a clannish tribe. They carried into the mountain desert the spirit with which they had lived in the Kentucky back hills. And the spirit of the clan is not wanted west of the Rockies, in the large spaces where a man's malice should dissolve before he had spread it like a poison into the blood of his relations. Therefore, when Salt Springs found out that if the toes of one Norman were stepped upon, the fists of 50 Normans avenged the hurt, the townsmen put their heads together, marvelled at this new spirit, and then began to frown. The Westerner does not make up his mind suddenly. He really is more conservative than the most hidebound New Englander. He is taught from his childhood to look on the better side of a man, and if a man has not a better side, then to avoid him altogether. The reason is simple. It is dangerous to disapprove of a man who wears a gun. It is far better to keep away from him. And above all, it is best to say nothing about him, lest tidings of what you have said be brought to his ear. Accordingly, Salt Springs saw the Normans, disapproved of them, and then waited in silence for something to happen. But on this day, when the Normans gathered in the streets of the town, every man armed, every man silently ugly, it was felt that they had overstepped the bounds of decorum. Salt Springs, in a word, disapproved, and hitched at its gun belt; and if the opposite party had not been a young mischief maker himself, there was every probability that the neutrals would have risen en masse and run the Normans out of the town. But as it was felt that this private war had best run its own course, though many public-spirited men shook their heads with the knowledge that, if Charley Valentine fell, it would be merely the beginning of constant warfare, for Morgan Valentine himself would take up arms, and when Morgan Valentine stirred, society was shaken to the roots. As for the other rumour, that Jess Dreer was mixed up in this matter, and was on the side of the Valentines, most people were inclined to disbelieve it. Besides, Dreer was to most of them a semi-mythical spirit. He came from the Southland, his crimes were not of their region, and the man himself was discounted. Compared with Jud Boone, a known force, he was nothing. But there was something so set and staged about this affair that Salt Springs began to grow excited before the morning was old. It drifted more and more thickly toward Danny Carroll's saloon, where the meeting was to take place; and all eyes, turning upon Jud Boone, who sat at a table in the corner, would then flick over to the prize saddle, which now lay at the other end of the bar, waiting for Charley Valentine.
Obviously, no one could look at the saddle and then at Jud Boone without picturing the gunfight which was coming. But where was Jess Dreer? He had not been seen. The loose-flung circle of the Normans had espied no one even distantly resembling the descriptions of the outlaw. Of course, no one dreamed of looking into the saloon, and in the saloon, least of all, would they have looked into the old closet at one end of the room. But here stood Jess Dreer, with the door ajar a fraction of an inch. From this he could not see the bar-room, but he could look down the long mirror behind the bar, and in this mirror he saw perfectly at second hand all that happened. He saw the crowd filter through the door, a silent crowd, lining up before the bar, and then breaking swiftly into groups that gathered along the wall, always hurrying across the line between the chair of Jud Boone and the door, as if at any moment Charlie Valentine might appear in this doorway and the guns be drawn. Jud Boone drank with a deep relish of the excitement which his presence roused. The number of the mustered Normans soothed his nerves. And if Jess Dreer were kept away from the saloon, this day his triumph would never be threatened. There was a sudden flurry around the door of the saloon. Every one stood up, except Jud Boone. Then the whisper passed down the room, rose to a murmur, to a deep voice: "Charlie Valentine is riding down the street, and he's coming alone." Alone, and into the very teeth of all this savage clan of Normans. All at once the men of Salt Springs began to remember that Charlie Valentine was young, handsome, of good family; that in his quarrels he had never taken an unfair advantage; that he had never actually killed; and then they looked from the open doorway to the face of Jud Boone, killer. The contrast was perfect. Not even Valentine's brother, not even his father, had come with the boy. It was as though the whole family trusted everything to the sense of fair play in Salt Springs. And that was the reason for the deep, stern hum that went about the saloon. Sheriff Claney, of course, was not there. His habit was to attend such affairs after, and not before. But Steve Harrison made himself spokesman when he went up to Gus Norman. "Look here, Gus," he said, "there ain't any mystery about why you got all your men out here today. But you take my advice. Stay clear of trouble. Don't start no mob action. It ain't popular around these parts. And write this down in red. Charlie Valentine is going to get a square deal." And as he stepped back, once more the murmur passed up and down the bar-room, approving. It was possible for Jess Dreer, in the closet, to watch the approach of Charlie Valentine down the street. Distant voices were calling from the outdoors, small at first, and then growing in volume. Were they murmurs of admiration, of sympathy? Jud Boone, at his table, finished his drink, and then leaned back in his chair. It was a careless attitude, but the hand which hung by the gunman's side was clenched until the skin whitened across the knuckles. Jess Dreer saw all this in the mirror. Then he heard, at the very door of the saloon, a woman's voice, pitched high and shrill. It was calling, "Oh, Charlie Valentine, don't go inside! They're going to murder you, Charlie!" Every man in the saloon stopped in the midst of gesture or spoken word. What a thrill in that girl's voice! Perhaps she was some old friend. She had danced with Charlie Valentine. She had known him when he was a child. She had even loved him, perhaps, and now she cried this warning. The affair had been grim before. It now suddenly became filled with horror. Then followed a heartbreaking pause, a dead silence outside the saloon. No voice within. What was happening? Had Charlie Valentine paused? Had the cry of this girl broken his nerve? Was he taking her advice and turning away? Was it this that accounted for the silence? Jess Dreer, believing this, sighed with relief. And then Charlie Valentine stepped into the doorway. It was the thing for which everyone in the saloon had been waiting and priming himself during the past hour or more. And here stood Charlie Valentine, dark against the white sunlight beyond. Being the center of attention, he seemed hardly more than a child.
Defiantly he had put on a shirt of blue silk, and he had a scarlet handkerchief around his neck. Poor fellow! His very gaudiness accentuated his deadly pallor. Purple circles surrounded his eyes. His mouth was set until the red of the lips disappeared. One could understand at a glance that this youngster had not slept, in expectation of the fight. Now he looked over the bar-room, with its crowd of faces, and smiled. There was no mistaking it. Every ounce of power in his soul and body was given to make that smile. His lips parted, and he tried to speak. He had to moisten his lips and try again before the sound would come. Very faintly: "Hello, boys. I've come for that saddle, Danny." Dan Carroll, from behind the bar, looked somberly at him, as much as to say, "Poor devil, you've come to be killed." Aloud he said: "It's yours, Charlie, and a beauty, too. Bring in the buckboard for it?" "Yep." And Charlie Valentine walked to the saddle, and put his hand on the horn of it. With one accord, every eye in the room turned toward Jud Boone. Yes, he was slowly rising. He had pulled down his hat a little. He was sauntering forward carelessly, with his hands dropped lightly upon his hips. Jess Dreer heard, near his door, a whisper which said: "It's plain murder. That kid again, Boone. It ought to be stopped." But who would stop it? Jud Boone was a known man. "Kind of a fine looking saddle, Valentine, ain't it?" Jud remarked. At the voice a shock went through Charlie Valentine, a shudder as though a powerful current of electricity had been flung through him. Then slowly, fighting himself to make his movements calm, he turned his head. His face was like death, but he forced a wan smile. A little whisper of admiration went up and down the saloon. The combatants were at length face to face. And what a contrast! As well send a stripling 2-year-old to try his horns against the scarred front of some bull who has long lorded it over his range. The sneering smile of Jud Boone was a silent token of his knowledge of superior strength, and the head of Valentine, held desperately high, was an equally eloquent token that he knew he was approaching his death. Chapters 21 and 22